Most people can ignore suffering for a few minutes. The scary part is how quickly a few minutes turns into an entire night. Rain hammered the neon roofs of Dock Sector 12 hard enough to shake rust from the old steel beams above Ethan Cole's repair garage. Water streamed through the gutters in silver sheets, carrying oil, ash, and the sour chemical smell that always rose from the lower city after midnight. Somewhere beyond the storm, cargo freighters groaned against their landing clamps, while warning sirens echoed through the harbor like tired ghosts. Ethan barely looked up from the cracked engine regulator in his hands. The portable heater near his boots rattled softly, pushing weak warmth across the concrete floor while an old jazz station hissed through static on the radio. Another long night. Another broken machine nobody else wanted to fix. He tightened a bolt with numb fingers and glanced at the digital clock glowing red above the tool rack. 3:14 a.m. The storm had been going for almost 9 hours now. Then the security monitor beeped. Ethan frowned. The outside camera rarely picked up movement during acid rain. Even the drunks knew better than to wander the dock roads when the runoff started burning through cheap fabric and exposed wiring. He wiped grease across his jeans and leaned toward the grainy screen mounted beside the garage door. At first, he thought the figure was a broken signpost swaying near the fuel station across the street. Thin, motionless, half hidden beneath flickering neon light. But then lightning flashed across the harbor skyline, and the camera sharpened for half a second. A woman stood there, alien, tall and unnaturally still beneath the rain. Water poured from her silver-white hair in streams. Her dark cloak hung soaked against her frame, heavy enough to drag at her shoulders. She wasn't trying to find shelter, wasn't calling for help. She just stood there beside the dead vending terminal while crowds passed her without slowing down. A pair of dock workers hurried by holding jackets over their heads. They looked directly at her, kept walking. Ethan stared at the screen. Something about it felt wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, just wrong in the quietest way possible. The camera timestamp rolled forward. 3:17 a.m. She still hadn't moved. Another flash of lightning illuminated her face. Pale blue-violet skin, sharp features, gold eyes reflecting neon like polished metal. Young. Exhausted. There was a thin black band wrapped around one wrist that looked almost medical beneath the rainwater. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Royal bio markings. Great. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. Dock law was simple about royal-class aliens. Don't interfere. Don't ask questions. Don't get involved in family disputes that could drag human civilians into off-world politics. Especially not this close to the trade sectors. He knew all of that. Every dock worker did. The radio crackled again while rain pounded the roof hard enough to drown thought. Ethan looked back toward the monitor. The alien woman finally moved. Barely. One trembling hand pressed against the vending machine to steady herself. That was when he noticed she wasn't wearing shoes. Ethan closed his eyes for one tired second. Damn it, he muttered. He shoved away from the workbench, grabbed the old brown canvas coat hanging beside the door, and killed the garage lights on his way out. Cold rain slammed into him instantly the moment the metal door rolled open. Acid droplets hissed against the pavement around his boots while neon signs reflected red and blue across the flooded street. The woman looked up slowly as he crossed toward her. Up close, she looked worse. Lips pale, shoulders shaking beneath the soaked fabric. There was fear in her eyes, but it sat underneath something older and heavier than fear. Pride maybe. Or exhaustion so deep it no longer had energy left for panic. Ethan stopped a few feet away. She watched him carefully, like she expected him to say something dangerous. Instead, he held out the coat. "You're freezing," he said quietly. The alien girl stared at him in silence while rainwater dripped from her silver hair onto the cracked pavement below. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Rain hissed against the pavement around Ethan's boots while neon light flickered across the flooded street in broken shades of red and blue. The alien girl kept her golden eyes fixed on him, wary and exhausted at the same time. Up close, he could see tiny burns scattered across the fabric wrapped around her arms where the acid rain had already started eating through the material. She should have collapsed hours ago. Ethan held the coat out a little farther. "Take it," he said. "This storm is getting worse." Her gaze dropped to the coat, then lifted back to him carefully. "Why?" Her voice was soft but strained, carrying the smooth accent of upper sector worlds. Ethan shrugged once. Because hypothermia is a stupid way to die. Something unreadable flickered across her expression. Not trust. Definitely not trust. More like confusion. As if kindness from strangers was something she no longer recognized on sight. Slowly, she reached for the coat. Her hand trembled before she caught herself and straightened her posture again, pride fighting exhaustion in real time. Ethan pretended not to notice. The moment the heavy canvas settled around her shoulders, she closed her eyes for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough for him to see how cold she really was. Thunder rolled somewhere over the cargo district. A freight shuttle roared overhead through the storm clouds, its engines vibrating through the street beneath their feet. Ethan glanced toward the nearly empty dock road. You got somewhere to go? The alien girl hesitated too long. Answer enough. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. There is a garage across the street, he said. Heat still works most nights. Her eyes narrowed immediately. Suspicion returned fast, sharp enough to hide the fear underneath it. You expect payment? Ethan almost laughed at that, but the look on her face stopped him. She was serious. Completely serious. Like every favor she had ever seen came attached to a price tag. No, he answered. I expect you not to pass out on my sidewalk. Another silence settled between them while rain hammered the metal awnings overhead. The city lights reflected in puddles around her bare feet. Ethan noticed one ankle was bruised beneath the torn edge of her cloak. Not fresh. A few days old at least. The black band around her wrist blinked faintly beneath the rainwater. Tracking tech. Expensive tracking tech. Definitely royal sector. Definitely trouble. Somewhere behind them, a pair of dock workers exited a late-night bar carrying steaming coffee cups. One of them spotted the alien woman instantly. His expression changed. He grabbed his friend's shoulder and quietly crossed to the other side of the street without saying a word. Ethan caught it. So did she. Her jaw tightened slightly. That bothered him more than he expected. Not fear. Not politics. Just the simple fact that everyone looked at her like she was already someone else's problem. Ethan rubbed rainwater from the back of his neck. Look, he said quietly. You can stand out here all night if you want. But if you fall unconscious, Dock Patrol will scan your wrist tag, and whatever you are running from will find you before morning. That got her attention. Her eyes sharpened immediately. How do you know I am running? Ethan glanced at the blinking restraint band again. Nobody wears military-grade tracking cuffs voluntarily. For the first time, real emotion crossed her face. Not fear this time. Shock. Like she had not expected a dock mechanic in a grease-stained jacket to recognize technology worth more than most apartments in Sector 12. Ethan opened the garage door behind him. Warm yellow light spilled across the rain-soaked pavement along with the smell of machine oil and burnt coffee. The old jazz station still played softly somewhere inside through static. He stepped aside without looking directly at her. You can leave whenever you want, he said. But you should get warm first. The alien girl stood motionless beneath the storm for another few seconds. Then finally, slowly, she walked past him into the light. Warm air rolled across the alien girl the moment the garage door sealed shut behind her. She stopped just inside the entrance, motionless beneath the dim yellow lights while rainwater dripped from the edges of Ethan's oversized coat onto the concrete floor. The place smelled like hot metal, motor oil, and burnt wiring. Old engine parts covered nearly every surface. Half disassembled. Cargo drones hung from ceiling mounts beside shelves stacked with tools worn smooth by years of use. Somewhere deeper inside the garage, a coolant pump hummed steadily beneath the soft crackle of jazz drifting through static. The alien girl's eyes moved carefully across the room, cataloging exits first. Ethan noticed immediately. Military habit. Or survival instinct. Probably both. He walked past her without comment and grabbed a clean towel from a shelf near the sink. Sit down before your legs give out, he said. She stiffened slightly at the order. I do not require assistance. Ethan handed her the towel anyway. Sure. Her golden eyes narrowed at him again, but the fight behind them looked weaker now. Exhaustion was winning. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the edge of an old storage crate beside the heater. The warmth hit her almost immediately. Ethan pretended not to notice the tiny shake in her breathing when feeling returned to her frozen hands. He moved toward the coffee machine near the back counter and poured steaming water into a dented metal mug. Tea, he asked. Or whatever passes for tea where you are from. You assume I am comfortable telling you where I am from. Ethan shrugged lightly while digging through a cabinet. You assume I care. That earned the faintest reaction from her. Not a smile exactly. More like surprise trying not to become one. Ethan found an old emergency ration tin and tossed it onto the workbench beside her. Soup packets are inside. She stared at the tin for a second without touching it. You continue offering things without negotiation. Yeah. Why? Ethan leaned against the counter and crossed his arms loosely. Outside, thunder rolled across the harbor again while acid rain rattled against the roof vents overhead. Because you look like somebody forgot you were alive. The words settled heavily between them. The alien girl lowered her eyes toward the steaming mug in her hands. For the first time since entering the garage, she looked genuinely uncertain what to say next. Ethan let the silence stay. People talked too much when they were nervous. Silence usually told the truth faster. After a while, she finally spoke. My name is Lyra. Ethan nodded once. Ethan. She glanced toward the garage entrance again. You understand that helping me may create complications for you. Probably. Yet you opened the door anyway. Ethan rubbed grease from his knuckles with a rag. Dock Sector 12 is already a complication. Another long silence followed. The heater rattled softly beside her while steam curled upward from the mug between her hands. Ethan noticed her fingers lingering near the warmth like she still did not fully trust it to stay. Then his eyes drifted back toward the black restraint band around her wrist. Up close, the technology looked even worse. Fine silver circuitry pulsed faintly beneath the surface, synchronized with her heartbeat. Not civilian-grade. High-end tracking hardware. Expensive enough to belong to governments or royal families. Lyra saw him looking. Instantly, her posture sharpened again. Defensive. Do not touch that, she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Was not planning to. Most humans would ask questions by now. Most humans are smarter than me. Her expression shifted again. Confusion mixed with cautious curiosity. Like she could not decide whether he was reckless or simply strange. Ethan walked toward the main control panel near the garage entrance and checked the external weather scan. Red storm warnings still flashed across the screen. Dock traffic suspended. Magnetic interference severe. No outbound flights until morning at the earliest. Great. He exhaled slowly and glanced back toward Lyra. She sat curled slightly closer to the heater now, silver hair drying unevenly against the collar of his coat while rain hammered the city outside. For the first time all night, she no longer looked like someone standing alone in a storm. She looked tired enough to finally stop pretending she was not. The storm intensified sometime after 4 in the morning. Wind howled through the narrow dock alleys hard enough to rattle the garage shutters, while warning sirens pulsed faint red through the rain outside. Ethan stood beneath the open engine housing of an old cargo hauler, tightening coolant lines beneath the harsh white glow of a hanging work lamp. Metal clicked softly beneath his tools. Across the garage, Lyra sat near the heater wrapped in his oversized coat, her attention drifting quietly through the room as if she still could not fully believe she was allowed to remain there. The steam from her empty mug had long faded. Neither of them spoke much. Strangely, it did not feel uncomfortable. The jazz station crackled low through the speakers overhead while rainwater tapped rhythmically against the roof vents. Ethan had always preferred silence over forced conversation anyway. Silence usually revealed who people really were once they stopped performing for each other. He glanced toward Lyra again while wiping grease from his hands. She was watching the shelves beside the far wall now. Old photographs sat there between stacks of machine parts and manuals. Human things. Small things. A fishing boat on a lake. A woman laughing beside a truck older than the city itself. A younger version of Ethan standing awkwardly in front of a repaired shuttle engine with grease across his face. Lyra noticed him looking. Your family? She asked quietly. Ethan followed her gaze toward the photographs. Used to be. Her golden eyes lingered on the picture of the woman for a moment. Your mate. He nodded once. Claire. Lyra lowered her eyes slightly. I am sorry. Ethan shrugged lightly and returned to the engine. Been a few years. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Lyra seemed to notice that. She studied him quietly while the heater hummed beside her legs. You still keep her photographs near you. Ethan tightened another bolt harder than necessary. Some things do not stop existing just because they hurt. The garage fell silent again after that. Not heavy silence. Just honest silence. Lyra slowly leaned back against the wall beside the heater, her expression softer now than when she first entered the garage. Less guarded. Ethan noticed she had finally stopped scanning every exit every few seconds. Progress. A loud burst of static suddenly crackled through the overhead radio, interrupting the music. Both of them looked up instantly. Then the emergency broadcast tone began. Attention, all dock sector residents. Severe magnetic storm conditions remain active through morning hours. Citizens are advised to avoid all unauthorized travel. Curfew enforcement units remain active due to increased off-world security concerns. Ethan frowned slightly at the wording. Off-world security concerns. That sounded specific. He glanced toward Lyra automatically. Her shoulders had gone rigid again. Her fingers tightened faintly around the edge of the coat wrapped around her. Ethan turned the radio volume lower without comment. You do not need to do that, Lyra said after a moment. Do what? Pretend you are not curious. Ethan walked toward the sink and rinsed grease from his hands beneath rusty hot water pipes. Curiosity gets expensive around here. And yet you still helped me. He dried his hands slowly with an old towel. Maybe I was tired of pretending not to notice people. Lyra stared at him in silence after that. The rain outside softened slightly for the first time all night, turning from violent impacts against the roof into a steadier rhythm. Ethan checked the weather monitor near the entrance again. Storm front still active. No outgoing flights until sunrise at minimum. He sighed quietly. There is a folding cot in the storage room, he said without looking at her. Not comfortable, but better than a metal crate. Lyra blinked in visible surprise. You would allow me to stay? Ethan gave her a tired look. Lyra, you can barely keep your eyes open. Almost immediately after he said it, she looked away. Because he was right. The exhaustion was finally impossible to hide now. Ethan crossed the garage toward the small storage room and switched on the dim overhead light inside. A narrow cot unfolded beside shelves full of old engine components and supply crates. Nothing elegant, nothing impressive, but warm, dry, safe. He stepped back toward the doorway. You can lock it from the inside if that helps. Lyra looked at the room for a long moment without moving. Then finally, very quietly, she asked, Why are you being kind to me? Ethan rested one tired hand against the doorframe while rain whispered softly against the city outside. Because somebody should have been sooner. Lyra did. Not lock the storage room door. Ethan noticed that sometime around dawn, while passing by with a box of replacement circuitry balanced against his shoulder. The narrow cot inside was occupied, though barely. She had fallen asleep, sitting partly upright against the wall, still wrapped in his oversized coat with one hand resting loosely near the black restraint band around her wrist. Pale blue morning light leaked through the high garage windows, turning the room silver and gray. For the first time since he found her outside, she looked young instead of dangerous. Ethan quietly lowered the supply box onto the nearby shelf, careful not to wake her. The storm had finally moved east toward the freight districts, leaving the city soaked beneath layers of fog and neon haze. Water dripped steadily from the roof gutters outside, while distant cargo horns echoed across the harbor. Dock Sector 12 always looked strange after heavy rain. Cleaner somehow. Like the city had briefly remembered what it used to be before the corporations and trade empires turned everything into rust and concrete. Ethan returned to the main garage floor and switched on the overhead work lights one row at a time. Engines hummed awake around him. Diagnostic screens flickered blue. The old coffee machine rattled violently before producing something barely drinkable. Normal morning. Mostly. Except every few minutes, his attention drifted back toward the storage room without permission. Around 7:30, he heard movement behind him. Soft footsteps. Careful ones. Ethan looked up from the open engine housing in front of him. Lyra stood near the doorway, one hand lightly touching the frame as though uncertain whether she was still allowed there. His coat hung loosely around her shoulders, sleeves too long for her hands. Her silver-white hair had dried unevenly overnight, falling in soft waves around her face instead of rain-soaked strands. She looked healthier already, still exhausted, but alive in a way she had not been last night. Ethan slid out from beneath the engine compartment and grabbed a second metal mug from the counter beside him. Coffee is terrible, he warned while pouring. But it is hot. Lyra stepped closer slowly, watching him the same way frightened animals watched open hands. You repair cargo engines alone? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded. Mostly transport ships. Dock crews break things faster than I can fix them. She accepted the mug carefully. Where I am from, technicians of your skill would have entire teams beneath them. Yeah, well, Ethan said, tightening a valve beside him. Where I am from, entire teams usually mean somebody important gets richer. To his surprise, Lyra let out the faintest breath of amusement. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that Ethan looked up from his tools for a second. The sound disappeared almost immediately, as if she was unaccustomed to hearing it from herself. Lyra walked slowly through the garage afterward, studying the rows of machines and spare parts with open curiosity now instead of fear. Her fingertips brushed lightly across the worn edge of a workbench scarred by years of welding burns. She paused near the shelf of photographs again. This time, Ethan noticed her eyes stop at a much smaller picture tucked behind the others. A little girl wearing oversized headphones sat on Ethan's shoulders beside a fishing pier, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Lyra looked toward him carefully. Your daughter. Ethan's wrench stopped turning for half a second. Emma, he answered quietly. Lyra seemed to recognize immediately that the name carried weight. Does she live nearby? Ethan stared at the engine in front of him a little too long before answering. No, the single word settled heavily into the garage air. Lyra lowered her gaze slightly. I apologize. I should not have asked. Ethan shook his head once. No reason you would know. Silence returned after that, softer than before. Not empty anymore. The heater still hummed near the back wall, while steam curled upward from their coffee mugs. Outside, the city slowly came back to life beneath the wet, gray morning sky. Then suddenly, every screen inside the garage flickered at once. Ethan frowned immediately. The security monitor near the entrance switched to emergency broadcast mode before stabilizing into a red government seal. Neither of them recognized. Lyra froze beside the workbench. Her face lost all color. A calm synthetic voice echoed through the garage speakers. Attention, all civilian sectors. Royal Transit authorities are conducting an active recovery operation involving a missing bio-class citizen. Harbor scans remain ongoing. Report all suspicious activity immediately. Ethan looked toward Lyra. She was already staring at the floor like she had just heard her own sentence being read aloud. The broadcast repeated every 12 minutes after that. Same calm synthetic voice. Same polished government wording that somehow made everything sound colder. Ethan muted the garage speakers after the third announcement, but the silence afterward felt worse. Lyra stood near the workbench with both hands wrapped tightly around the coffee mug he gave her earlier. The drink had gone cold long ago. She had not taken another sip. Outside, traffic slowly returned to the harbor streets as morning settled over Dock Sector 12. Cargo loaders rolled through puddles beneath blinking neon signs, while freighter engines growled somewhere above the clouds. Normal city noise. Normal city rhythm. But inside the garage, tension sat heavy in the air like static before lightning. Ethan wiped his hands with a rag and leaned against the side of the engine compartment. How bad is it? Lyra did not answer immediately. Her golden eyes stayed fixed on the frozen government seal glowing faintly across the monitor screen. Bad enough, she said quietly at last, that they are willing to scan civilian sectors publicly. Ethan studied her for a moment. You are not some runaway thief. It was not really a question. Lyra lowered her gaze toward the black restraint band around her wrist. In daylight, the silver circuitry beneath the surface looked almost delicate. Too elegant for something designed to control a person. No, she admitted softly. I am not. Ethan nodded once, unsurprised. Royal family? A long silence followed. Then finally, almost reluctantly, she answered. My bloodline governs the Varian trade systems. Ethan let out a low breath through his nose. That sounds expensive. To his surprise, Lyra gave another tiny, almost smile before it faded again. Expensive enough that my life stopped belonging to me a very long time ago. Ethan watched her carefully while the heater hummed softly behind them. There it was again. Not arrogance. Not superiority. Just exhaustion buried under years of pretending strength was the same thing as freedom. Lyra slowly pulled back the sleeve covering her wrist. This restraint band tracks my location, my pulse, stress levels, hormone fluctuations, sleep cycles. Ethan frowned. That is excessive. I am considered genetically valuable. The way she said it made Ethan's stomach tighten slightly. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Worse than that. Practiced. Like she had been taught to describe herself as property for so long the language no longer sounded strange coming out of her mouth. Ethan stared at the restraint band another second before speaking carefully. And what exactly happens when they find you? Lyra looked away toward the rain-streaked garage windows. I return home. That bad, huh? A bitter flicker crossed her face. Home is where they decide who I marry, what treaties I secure, what children I eventually produce. Ethan went still. Outside, a shuttle engine roared overhead, rattling the loose tools hanging from the walls. Lyra's voice remained calm, but only barely. I was never meant to be a person first, Ethan. Only useful. Something inside him shifted hearing that. Maybe because he recognized the tone. Not the politics. Not the royalty. Just the quiet numbness of someone who had spent too long surviving instead of living. Ethan glanced toward the old family photographs on the shelf again, without meaning to. Claire smiling in sunlight. Emma laughing beside the lake. Ghost from a version of himself that felt impossibly far away now. So you ran, he said quietly. Lyra nodded once. During a diplomatic transfer near the outer sectors. I disabled the escort systems and escaped before they could sedate me. Ethan blinked slowly. You escaped a royal convoy by yourself? I had motivation. There was a faint trace of pride in her voice now. Small. Human, almost. Ethan shook his head in disbelief and let out the closest thing to a laugh he had managed in weeks. You know, for somebody who looked half dead outside my garage, you are apparently terrifying. That finally earned a real reaction from her. Tiny. Brief. But real. A soft laugh escaped before she caught herself. The sound filled the garage warmer than the heater ever could. Then suddenly Lyra's expression changed. Her eyes snapped toward the front windows. Ethan turned instantly. Two black surveillance drones drifted slowly past the garage entrance outside, scanning storefronts one by one with pale blue search beams. The machines hovered silently through the fog, like patient predators. Lyra's face lost color again. Ethan reached for the light controls without hesitation and killed the front half of the garage instantly. Shadows swallowed the windows while the drones continued drifting closer through the rain. The garage remained dark except for the weak glow coming from the diagnostic panels near the back wall. Ethan stood perfectly still beside the light controls while the surveillance drones drifted past outside. Pale blue skin beams slid slowly across the rain-covered street, reflecting against puddles and broken neon signs. The machines moved with unsettling calm, never rushing, never hesitating. Like they already knew nobody could truly hide from them forever. Lyra barely breathed beside the workbench. Ethan could hear it anyway. Small, controlled breaths. Someone trying very hard not to panic. One of the drones paused directly outside the garage entrance. Its sensor beams swept across the metal shutters, lingering for 2 full seconds before continuing onward. Ethan kept his eyes on the window without moving a muscle. Finally, after what felt much longer than it probably was, the machines drifted farther down the block and disappeared into the fog. Only then did Lyra slowly exhale. Ethan waited another few seconds before switching part of the lights back on. Warm yellow light returned gradually across the garage floor. They are getting closer, Lyra said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Yeah. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the workbench. You should turn me in. Ethan looked over at her. What? Before this becomes dangerous for you. He stared at her for a second, trying to decide whether she actually believed that was kindness or simply habit. You really think I would do that now? Lyra lowered her eyes. Most people would. Ethan leaned against the engine housing behind him and folded his arms loosely. Most people left you standing in the rain. Silence followed. Outside, distant traffic hummed through the wet harbor streets while water dripped steadily from the roof gutters. Lyra looked tired again. Not physically this time. Emotionally tired. Like she had spent too many years preparing herself for abandonment before it could surprise her. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the weather monitor. Those drones are probably tied into the city grid, he muttered. If your restraint band is transmitting, they will eventually narrow the signal. Lyra instinctively covered the black band with her sleeve again. I tried disabling it before I reached the city. And it sent my pulse rate directly to royal security. Ethan let out a low whistle. That is insane. No, Lyra said softly. That is normal where I come from. Ethan looked at her for a long moment after that. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "That is not living." Something fragile crossed her expression hearing those words. Not dramatic, just sudden stillness, as if nobody had ever separated her existence from her usefulness before. A loud metallic knock echoed suddenly from the front shutter. Both of them froze instantly. Another knock followed. Firm. Human this time. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said quietly. Lyra immediately shook her head. "Ethan, back room. Now." Something in his voice stopped her from arguing further. She disappeared silently into the storage area, just as Ethan crossed toward the garage entrance. He opened the side inspection hatch instead of the main door. A broad-shouldered dock worker stood outside beneath the foggy morning light, holding a data tablet under one arm. Marcus Hale, local freight supervisor. Ethan had known him almost 10 years. "You look terrible," Marcus said immediately. "Thanks." Marcus glanced past him into the dim garage interior. "Dock patrol is all over the sector this morning. You hear about the royal runaway?" Ethan shrugged carefully. "Hard not to." Marcus lowered his voice. "People are saying the reward is over 500,000 credits." Ethan remained expressionless. Marcus studied him for another second before holding up the data tablet. A glowing identification image rotated slowly across the screen. Lyra. Her silver-white hair framed beside a royal insignia Ethan did not recognize. Even in the official image, her eyes looked tired. "You seen her?" Marcus asked quietly. Ethan's pulse slowed instead of rising. Old instinct. Years of dealing with customs officers and cargo inspectors taught him that calm mattered more than lies. "Nope," he answered evenly. Marcus stared at him another moment. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the garage roof between them. Finally, Marcus sighed and lowered the tablet. "If you do see anything strange, stay out of it," he warned. "Royal people do not play fair." Ethan gave a short nod. "Never met rich people who did." Marcus snorted softly before heading back toward the street. Ethan watched him disappear into the fog before sealing the hatch shut again. When he turned around, Lyra stood silently near the storage room doorway. Her face had gone pale. "500,000 credits," she whispered. Ethan grabbed a wrench from the counter and walked back toward the engine compartment without looking at her. "Still not enough to make me like paperwork." The garage stayed quiet after Marcus left. Too quiet. Ethan returned to the engine compartment and tightened the same bolt 3 separate times before finally setting the wrench down in irritation. Across the room, Lyra remained standing near the storage doorway with his coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. 500,000 credits. The number still hung in the air between them like smoke. Enough money to leave Dock Sector 12 forever. Enough to buy a clean apartment in the upper districts. Enough to stop counting repair invoices before buying groceries. Ethan knew exactly how much that kind of money could change a life because he had spent years not having it. Lyra looked toward the photographs on the shelf again before speaking softly. "Your friend was correct." Ethan glanced up. "About what?" "People like mine do not play fair." Ethan gave a dry half-smile. "Pretty sure that applies to every tax bracket." But Lyra did not smile back this time. Her eyes drifted toward the rain-streaked front windows instead. "They will continue searching until they find me," she said quietly. "And eventually they will realize this sector contains the strongest signal." Ethan folded the grease rag in his hands slowly. "Probably. Then I should leave before that happens." The words came out calm. Too calm. Like she had already accepted the decision hours ago and was only saying it aloud now because it would hurt less if she left first. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "You planning to walk back into that storm again?" "I survived before." "That is not what I asked." Lyra lowered her gaze. The silence stretched between them while distant harbor horns echoed across the city outside. Ethan rubbed one tired hand across the back of his neck and looked away first. That annoyed him more than it should have. "You know," he muttered, "you are really bad at staying somewhere safe." A faint sadness touched her expression then. "Safe places rarely stay safe around me." Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but a sudden sharp pulse echoed from somewhere inside the garage. Both of them froze instantly. A blinking red light appeared beneath the black restraint band around Lyra's wrist. Once, twice, then faster. Lyra's face went pale. "No," she whispered. Ethan crossed the room immediately. "What is happening?" "The tracker." She pressed trembling fingers against the band. "The drones must have narrowed the scan radius." A cold synthetic tone suddenly emitted from the restraint device. Royal biometric confirmation pending. Ethan swore under his breath. Can you shut it off? Not completely. The blinking red light accelerated. Outside, faint engine noise echoed somewhere above the harbor streets. Not civilian traffic. Something heavier. Lyra stepped backward instinctively. Ethan, listen to me carefully. No, the answer came so fast it surprised. Both of them. Ethan stared directly at the flashing restraint band before looking back up at her. Nobody gets handed back today. Lyra's breath caught slightly. You do not understand what they will do if they discover you helped me. Ethan moved toward the main control panel near the garage entrance and started typing commands into the aging system. Yeah, well, I already had trust issues with authority before this morning. Ethan, storage tunnel access still works beneath the old fuel lines. He continued, mostly thinking aloud now. Half the sector forgot those maintenance routes exist after the flooding. Lyra stared at him in disbelief. You are planning an escape route. I am planning options. He grabbed an old portable scanner from the shelf and checked the incoming traffic grid. 3 unidentified aerial signatures were already approaching Dock Sector 12 from the upper city sectors. 2 organized to be random patrol units. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Great. Lyra stepped closer carefully, her golden eyes fixed on him now with something deeper than confusion. Why are you doing this for me? Ethan looked up from the scanner. For a second, neither of them spoke. Rainwater still dripped softly outside the garage, while warning lights reflected across the wet windows in red and blue streaks. Finally, Ethan answered quietly, because every time you talk about your life, you sound like somebody apologizing for existing. Lyra went completely still. Ethan lowered the scanner onto the counter beside him. And I am getting real tired of hearing people talk about you like an object. The blinking restraint band pulsed faster again between them. Somewhere above the city, engines thundered closer through the clouds. But for the first time since Ethan found her standing alone in the rain, Lyra no longer looked afraid of being hunted. She looked afraid of being cared about. The first Royal shuttle arrived just after sunset. Its engines vibrated through Dock Sector 12 like distant thunder, while blue searchlights swept across the harbor skyline. Ethan stood near the garage entrance watching the reflections move through the rainwater outside. The storm had finally passed, but the streets still glistened beneath wet neon and drifting fog. Somewhere farther down the block, people hurried indoors as the black aircraft descended between the warehouse towers with silent precision. Nobody in the lower districts trusted official visitors, especially not armed ones. Behind him, Lyra remained near the workbench where she had spent most of the afternoon pretending she was not listening for approaching engines. The restraint band around her wrist had gone quiet again after Ethan wrapped half the thing in salvaged signal mesh from an old cargo relay. Temporary solution. At best. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Maintenance tunnels open 2 blocks east, he said. We still have time. Lyra slowly shook her head. No, Ethan frowned immediately. No. She stepped closer into the dim garage light, silver-white hair catching faint gold reflections from the overhead lamps. If you continue helping me, they will not stop with arrest warrants or fines. They will erase your entire life until there is nothing left. Ethan let out a tired breath through his nose. You really think fear is a convincing sales pitch after living here this long? Ethan. Lyra. She fell silent after that. Outside, the shuttle engines powered down somewhere beyond the fog. Heavy footsteps echoed faintly through the distant harbor streets. Search teams spreading outward. Ethan crossed toward the old shelf beside the workbench and grabbed his brown canvas coat from where Lyra folded it earlier that afternoon. He held it out toward her again. Take it. Her expression softened immediately. You need it more. I have lived through worse winters. She stared at the coat for a second before accepting it carefully with both hands. The movement looked strangely intimate despite how simple it was. Like trust itself weighed something physical between people. Ethan glanced toward the garage windows. You know, he said quietly, when I first saw you out there last night, I figured you were either dangerous or unlucky. Lyra's golden eyes lifted toward him. And now, Ethan shrugged lightly. Now I think you were just tired. Something fragile moved. Across her face then. Not sadness exactly. More like grief finally being allowed to rest for a minute. The garage suddenly flooded with rotating blue light from outside. Both of them looked toward the entrance instantly. Voices echoed faintly through the fog-covered street. Closer now. Ethan reached toward the control panel beside the main shutter. Lyra caught his wrist gently before he could touch it. "No more running," she whispered. Ethan looked down at her hand against his arm. Small, cold, trembling slightly despite her effort to hide it. "You said yourself they will not stop searching." "They will if I surrender willingly." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That is not surrender. That is ownership." Lyra's eyes glistened faintly beneath the overhead lights. "Maybe where I come from, there is no difference." The words hit him harder than he expected. For a second, neither of them spoke. Outside, footsteps splashed through puddles closer and closer toward the garage entrance. Then quietly, almost carefully, Ethan reached up and removed the old silver chain from around his neck. A small weathered ring hung from it beneath the light. Claire's ring. He had not taken it off in 3 years. Lyra stared at it in surprise as he pressed the chain gently into her palm. "Ethan, you keep looking at people like you are waiting for them to stop caring," he said softly. "Claire used to do that after Emma died." His voice remained calm, but only barely now. "Took me years to realize grief can make people feel like a burden for surviving." Lyra looked at the ring resting in her hand, as though it weighed far more than metal should. The voices outside stopped directly in front of the garage. Silence followed, then a single knock against the shutter. Firm. Official. Ethan and Lyra looked at each other one last time beneath the warm yellow garage lights and the fading sound of rainwater dripping outside. Then slowly, unexpectedly, Lyra stepped forward and rested her forehead lightly against his chest for one quiet second. No fear. No politics. No royalty. Just gratitude too large for words. When she finally stepped back, tears shimmered faintly in her golden eyes. "You were the first person," she whispered softly, "who saw me before seeing what I could be used for." Another knock echoed through the garage. Ethan opened the shutter halfway. Cold evening air rolled inside, carrying mist and blue searchlights with it. A line of royal officers stood waiting outside beside the black shuttle. At their center stood an older woman with silver markings woven across deep blue skin. Her expression hardened the moment she saw Lyra behind him. But then something unexpected happened. Lyra stepped forward on her own and raised one calm hand before anyone could speak. "You will address him respectfully," she said quietly. Every officer outside immediately fell silent. The older woman studied Ethan carefully after that, long enough to notice the worn garage, the grease-stained tools, the repaired restraint mesh around Lyra's wrist, and the old human wedding ring still clutched carefully in Lyra's hand. Understanding slowly crossed the woman's face. Not political understanding, personal understanding. Ethan stepped back without a word as Lyra moved toward the shuttle waiting beyond the fog. Halfway there, she turned once more beneath the harbor lights. The city wind lifted strands of silver-white hair across her face while neon reflections shimmered in the wet pavement below. "Thank you for opening the door," she said softly. Then she disappeared into the light. Hours later, long after the shuttle vanished into the clouds above Dock Sector 12, Ethan returned alone to the quiet garage. The heater still hummed softly near the workbench. 2 untouched coffee mugs sat exactly where they left them. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. Resting carefully beside the old family photographs was a small silver access key engraved with the royal seal of the Varian Systems. Beneath it sat a handwritten note in elegant blue ink. "For the human who reminded me that kindness is not weakness." Outside, rain began falling softly across the harbor again. But this time, the city no longer felt cold.